Much, Marie. Is that coming through all right, Marina, hearing my sound? Excellent. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Zoomers, and good evening. It's lovely to have a live audience as well. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I should say it's good of you to support both the Cathedral and Conservation 50, because my fee will be going to Conservation 50. And you may remember Conservation 50 was set up in 2019 to mark 50 years of conservation area in St Albans. And we've continued to support other projects. One of the projects that we're supporting is blue plaques, and I've got good news on that. We're very nearly going to put our first blue plaque up. That would be exciting. I'll let everyone know. We're working on trying to both clean up the alleyways and also decorate the lovely historical alleyways of St Albans, which some of you will know are not a very good state at the moment. And we're also working towards trying to set up a conservation advisory panel to help preserve some of the city's heritage. Anyway, tonight I'm going to talk about the Armenian Church, and the title perhaps doesn't quite give the significance of what I'm going to be talking about, because if I talk about the Armenian Church, I'm really talking about the Armenian nation, because the two are very intertwined. Now, the reason this talk came about is some of you will be aware that last year there was a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And the conflict was over this very contentious area, Nagorno-Karabakh, a mountainous area, which is populated by Armenians and has been for a long time, but found itself during the Soviet period actually within the territory of Azerbaijan and is almost surrounded by Azerbaijan. And I'll explain that as we go along. What I'm going to do tonight is take you really through the history of Armenia with the foundation of the Armenian Church, which is very important in terms of, and I'll repeat this, the first state Christian church, 301, the first state to adopt Christianity, even before the Roman Empire. So very important. And how the Armenian Church has helped preserve Armenian culture and identity right through the centuries in what has been a very difficult time for Armenians, trapped between very large powers, often overwhelmed by large powers, and finding itself sometimes isolated as a Christian community surrounded by Muslim neighbors. So the two really go hand in hand. Now, my connection with it really comes through my studies as a student when I studied Byzantine history, because Byzantium was very connected with Armenia. And Armenians, in fact, not only had their own state at that time, sometimes controlled by the Byzantines, sometimes not, but also were a very important part of Byzantium. Armenian architects and even one emperor was of Armenian descent. So the Armenians are very connected with that world, and they continue to be very connected with the Ottoman Empire, and we'll see how that spins out. I do want to just, and I hope you can all see this, and some of you are a bit far away in the live audience, but if you look at that first slide, and we'll be talking about the lovely Armenian monasteries later, if you look at that first slide, right at the bottom, you'll see that in 1228, an Armenian archbishop came to St Albans. And in 1252, a group of Armenians stayed in the abbey, though in fact, they probably stayed across the road in George Street, where there was the original hostel for people who came to visit the abbey. Now, I found this quotation from a historian, and sadly, she's no longer with us, Antonia Granson. And I think she found it, but I haven't proved this yet. I think she found it in the Chronicles of Matthew Paris. But if anyone could tell me which chronicle it turned up in, I'd be very grateful to find the actual reference, because I would have put the reference up, but I couldn't find it. And not being a scholar of Matthew Paris, I wasn't sure. Though some of you will know I'm very fond of Matthew Paris's description of the elephant that was kept in the Tower of London. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to start with, can you all see that? So due to social distancing, my live audience are farther away. I think you on Zoom have probably got a closer picture of this. I'm going to start with what's called the Kingdom of Urartu. Now, the legends take Armenians right the way back to Noah and Mount Ararat. But in terms of historical understandings, we really come across them through the Assyrians and through the Hittites, who had conversations with them, and we've got their name and inscription. And as we'll discover, Armenia is a name that was given by the outsiders to the country, not the name that the Armenians gave themselves. So I'm starting with Urartu because it's our first known contact, and we're pretty certain, and Armenians are a very ancient nation, pretty certain that this is Armenian, and it's the beginning of the Armenian territory where they were mainly sited. Now, they were famous, next slide please, for their metalwork. I'm just going to show the capital, which is by Lake Van. If we go back, Mary, I can just point out Lake Van. This is for the live audience. Zoom audience, you probably can't see this, but you'll see there's a lake, a large lake there. And this is where they had their stronghold, their capital. Next slide. And there it is, Tushpa, and it's still there, but obviously now a ruin, and later it was a medieval fortress and so on. So that's where they were situated. And you can see behind the mountains with where Ararat was. And I've got some Armenians in the audience, I think, or Armenians of descent. Is it not true that Ararat is your home? That's where you really come from. Absolutely, good. I'm glad I got that right. Next slide, please. And I wanted to show you just a little bit of the metalwork of Urartu. They were great metalworkers, prized for their metalworking. And you'll see on the left, we've got a plaque, and it's actually written in cuneiform. That's strange little wedge shapes. So this is before the Armenian language was actually written down, but it's in cuneiform. And it says that this plaque, which probably came to Tushpa from the arsenal of Argishu. And on the right, you've got a copper alloy vessel handle in the shape of a bull. And the bull was very important to the Urartuans, and the bull theme turns up very often. So that's the first sort of settled state we've got of Armenians. Next slide, please. Now, the kingdom of Armenia was really established in the 6th century, and it was started with the Yovandian dynasty. And you'll see at the top there, it says Kingdom of Armenia, High Astan, which is the name Armenians call themselves. And we'll come to see why that was, because it was built on the legend of a character, a hero called Hayek. And there he is. Now, we only know about him really from the 5th century AD. So it's a legend really, rather than a historical character that we're talking about. But it's the outside nations who refer to their Kingdom of Armenia. So the big first power to take them over is, of course, Persia. And it starts with the Medes, but then the Persians in the 6th century conquer that whole area. They conquer what is now modern Turkey. They conquer all the way through to Egypt. Persian Empire, huge and very successful. The Persian Empire then, in 336, is overthrown by Alexander the Great, who comes along and sweeps away the Persian rule and imposes a Hellenistic rule. After his death, you probably recall, his kingdoms all break up into different groups. And what happens to Armenia? It's incorporated in the Seleucid, one of Alexander's generals who controlled that area. However, Armenia breaks away from the Seleucid Empire, and as you can see by the 2nd century BC, under Artaxerxes I, there's a consolidated Armenian state. And he founds the Artaxiad dynasty, which is incredibly successful. And the Armenians themselves then become quite imperialist under Tigranes the Great. There's a nice coin of Tigranes here with his headdress. And what's fascinating about this, and it is speculation, only speculation, but there's a star between two eagles. Can you see that? The star between two eagles. And that is thought to have been the appearance of Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet appears every 75, 76 years. Of course, sometimes it's further away, sometimes it's clear, but we can see it in that cycle. And we know that at that time, in 87 BC, Halley's Comet was very close to the Earth, and could be seen. And we think that perhaps that's what it is. Pure speculation, but it's a nice thought, isn't it? Anyway, Tigranes was extremely successful. Next slide, please. And as you can see, he expanded Armenia enormously. First of all, from what is called Greater Armenia, which was roughly where Urartu was, and you can see that at the top. And then he moved both west and south and a little bit to the east. And he even at sometimes had the Holy Land, Jerusalem, as a vassal area. So he conquered some areas and other states caved in and they usually paid tribute or whatever. So he was immensely successful. The problem for Tigranes was that he was going to come up against two superpowers. And the superpowers in the region was the Persians now under the Parthian Empire and the emerging power to the west. And you know who that's going to be? Rome. Rome indeed. Next slide, please. And so Armenia found itself squeezed between these two ancient superpowers. Tigranes himself faced up to the Romans and was defeated at Tigranocerta. Now, he was very lucky because the Roman general Lucullus was recalled to Rome in a political scandal, a lot of vying going on. Lucullus, you might recall, was famous for his hedonism. And when he returned to Rome, he built the most beautiful gardens, the Lucullan gardens, but he was out of politics, removed from politics. And ambitious Gnaeus Pompeius took his place. And Pompey was short of money. Pompey was short of money because, of course, he'd had to pay. The Roman rule was you needed 3 fortunes in Rome. The first fortune was to get elected. The second fortune was to pay off all your political rivals. And the third fortune was when you were sued for corruption and you had to bribe your way out of the court. And Pompey was short of money. So when he was made a generous offer by Tigranes, he accepted, and Armenia was able to sustain itself and remain essentially free. It was in a vassal relationship to Rome. And what you've got there is the Greater Armenia, the kingdom of Tigranes. And he not only a great general, but he was obviously clearly a very good political manipulator. So although he lost against the Romans, in a way, it didn't matter because he was able to consolidate. What he did lose was the empire, because obviously the new superpowers took over. And of course, it wasn't long after this situation that the Romans themselves found themselves in trouble with the Parthians. So that conflict of power. Now, on this slide, you've got a sculpture of Pompey. I always think he looks very worried and rather, look very dynamic character, does he there? I don't know what the artist was doing, but I want to show you where you've got classical influence, Greek and Roman influence in this wonderful temple at Garni. Now, that temple, as you see it now, is a reconstruction because it was actually being very badly damaged over the years by earthquakes. But it's a lovely temple, which Tiridates the first dedicated to his wife. What a nice idea. He dedicated the temple to his wife. And there is an inscription, and you can see there, dated to AD 77. And the inscription is in Greek, because at this time, there is no Armenian alphabet. So it's not a literate society. They're relying on Greek and Persian at this stage. And the inscription suggests that this temple was probably dedicated to Mithras, the sun god. So it was connected to the sun god. And that was probably the influence of the Persians who were Zoroastrian, who worshipped the sun through Zoroaster. Next slide, please. Now we move into Christian Armenia, and we're getting close to the Armenian Church. The legend is that Bartholomew and Synthetus spread Christianity originally in the Armenian territories. And of course, they came up against a lot of opposition and were martyred, duly martyred because of the pagan anti-Christian movements. However, in 301, St. Gregory, known as the Illuminator, and the Illuminator is because, of course, he converted Tiridates and therefore he illuminated the ruling thing. He actually started off having a bad time. He was imprisoned by Tiridates for 14 years before he was then released. And the story goes then he was able to convert him. And Tiridates adopted Christianity, making Armenia the first state to adopt Christianity. Rome went on later to adopt Christianity after 311, 312. So it was behind Armenia. And I have some Armenians in the audience or Armenian descent who I'm sure are very proud that they were there number one as a Christian state. And Ekni Adzin was the cathedral church, which you can see down here, and you can see roughly where it is on the map in Armenia. Interesting because it means it came from a dream, in a sense, from Gregory, because he had this dream that the church should be planted there, and the only begotten descended, because he actually believed Christ came down on that spot. Now, the church you're looking at now is a 16th century church, because over the years, the original church has suffered. There are some original bits built in, but we'll come on to the rather unique and beautiful architecture of Armenia later on. Next slide, please. So we now have Christianity rooted in Armenia, but it's not going to be easy because, again, the superpowers are still wanting to grapple. And in particular, Persia becomes dominant in this area. And you can see how Persia has, and it's labeled there, Persian Armenia. The Byzantines and the Persians in the end agree to divide Armenia between them. And Armenia itself then is subjugated to particularly the Persians initially, and then to the Byzantines. But during this time, and this is absolutely crucial for the preservation of Christianity, Mesrop Mashtots invents the Armenian alphabet. So they've got their own alphabet, which then they can disseminate throughout Armenia. And that's very important for the national identity, to be able to have your own alphabet. And interesting enough, in 451, Vartan Mamikonian secures the Christian religion by being defeated by the Persians. This is an interesting state where you actually get defeated, but you celebrate that defeat. And strategically, the Armenians actually outmaneuvered the Persians, who then, in the Treaty of Narsak, agree to allow the Armenians to worship Christianity, and they do not have to conform to the Persian religion at this time. So that was a very important date. So we've now got Armenia firmly established as a Christian state, turning and looking back to its foundation of Christianity. Very powerful. Next slide, please. Just as that Christianity has been confirmed, a theological row develops. Now, I'm not a theologian, but I did teach a course on heresy at the cathedral. So I'm fairly up to the little nuances. The problem for Christianity at this stage, and it is a problem in a sense, is that it is rooted in the philosophic tradition of the Greeks. And so you've got religion trying to react to rationality, and the two find it quite difficult to coexist. The big debate is Christ's nature. What is his nature? He is both human and divine. But how does that work? How does that work? So the Council of Chalcedon come together, one of the many councils, to try and work out what the nature of Christ is. And of course, they don't satisfy everybody and they go in different directions. This is a rather, I think, clever cartoon. I'm very grateful to Laurie Demott for his cartoon, he's American, and trying to explain what is really quite, for us, in the modern day, an obtuse argument. Now, we'll start with the Monophysites. The Monophysites, from the Greek, monos, meaning only one, physos, meaning nature, only one nature. But this isn't just one nature, it is only one nature. It's indivisible. There's no recognition. We cannot see the divine or the human. It's just one nature. Now, the Miaphysites, of which the Armenian Church belongs, are not quite so emphatic. what they're saying is there's a one combined, but you can, don't have to be too pinning it down to just one nature. You can see that there's a one nature, but it's combines, there's a combination there of divine and human. So the Armenian Church goes for that. The Diophysites say, no, 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 you cannot mix human and divine together. Doesn't work. Divine will have to dominate. And the two-headed characters on the far right of the cartoon illustrates this dilemma of identifying. And that particular position was taken up by the Bishop Nestorius and led to the Nestorian Church, which still does exist in parts of China, oddly enough. And I was talking earlier to a member of the audience about the silk trade. It went along the Silk Route. It went along the Silk Route. And then the Western Church under the Pope took the position of consubstantial, two natures in one. We know that there are two natures there, and we as humans do not have the capacity. We do not have the capacity to understand God's position. So the two are there, we just celebrate them and don't try and disentangle them. Don't try and work it out. So the two natures are there, we can refer to them, but we don't understand them because that's something beyond our power. So already there's a split then between the Western Church and the Oriental churches, of which Armenia is one, in the East, because they are Miaphysite, and they still think there is only one nature. We can't see the two. It's there somewhere as one nature. Next slide. This is going to be quite important later on, as we shall see. Now, independent Armenia then has a new enemy. Persian Empire is overwhelmed by the rise of Islam and the immense expansion of Islam. Lots of the Byzantine provinces like Egypt and Palestine fall to the Arabs coming out of Arabia, and so does the Persian Empire. So the Persian Empire is replaced by the Abbasid Caliphate, the Abbasids living in Baghdad who are aggressive and expansionist. And so poor old Armenia finds itself having to defend itself from not just Byzantines in the West, but more importantly from the Arabs in the East and the South, who are very powerful. And Armenia is disputed then between the Arabs. It becomes a battleground. Fortunately, Ashot I in the 9th century is able to defeat the local Arab leaders, because what's happened is the Abbasid Empire is losing power and control, and they're local leaders. And so Ashot is able to establish the Bagratid dynasty, who take power, and he gets recognized by the rulers in Baghdad. At the same time, a year later, the Byzantines recognize also his sovereignty, and so Armenia is secured at this point. And you can see it's again, this is what we would call the Greater Armenia, just looking at the map, just so you can see. You've got it running really, if you see the two lakes, Severn and Lake Van, and all the territory around. This is what we call the Greater Armenia, and that's significant later on, as we shall see. Next slide, please. Now, during this period of independence, the church flourishes, and the monasteries flourish, and the churches flourish. Over 4,000 monasteries are built and still survive. Monasteries and churches throughout Armenia, famous for it. And look at this fantastic position here. Mount Ararat in the background, and here we have Khor Virap. Khor Virap is important because that's where Gregory the Illuminator was imprisoned by Tiridates. What survived today, again, has been something that has been rebuilt in the 17th century mainly, again, because of the wars and all the trampling over a lot of these monasteries. If they weren't damaged by earthquakes, natural phenomenon, they were damaged by war. But that's beautiful. And you'll notice there, we'll come on to talk about Armenian architecture, which is quite unique and very beautiful, I think. Next slide, please. This is the monastery, which I showed earlier on, and what a wonderful and amazing setting. And I gather that many members of the audience, well, a few members of the audience have been there several times. Beautiful. Next slide, please. Now, Ashot III, do you remember Ashot I established the Bagratids? Ashot III transferred the capital to Arni, which became known as the city of 1001 churches. Sadly, it's a ruin today, a tourist destination rather than anything else. And it no longer sits in Armenia, but is in Turkey. And you can see from the map on the left, it's close to the Armenian border, but Armenia has shrunk. The greater Armenia has shrunk, and we'll come on to see how that happens. You can see on the other map where it's situated with the right circle around the site. And I've put in just some slides. There's a panoramic view at the bottom of the ruins and many of the churches there, and also of the walls of Arni. A very important place. Today, we know of 50 churches there, 33 cave churches, and over 20 chapels. So though it wasn't 1001, there were an awful lot of churches and chapels. Next slide, please. And here are a few of them, the main ones. What we've got down at the bottom of the slide is a reconstruction of what Arni would look like. I don't know if you can see that very well. Again, probably our Zoom people can see it better than the people in the room. But I've ringed where the churches are, I'm going to point out. So the Cathedral Church, the Church of the Holy Mother of God, right up in the left-hand top corner, 989. Unfortunately, its dome is missing, but it had a dome like most Armenian churches. Most Armenian churches, we would say, are centrally planned, and I'll come on to what that means, compared to basilical type churches, which are laterally planned. So that's the Cathedral Church. Then the Church of the Redeemer, which is in a very sad state, I'm afraid, the next one along, 1035, and you can see on the map where that is, and on the reconstruction. On the map there, circled in green, on the reconstruction in white. And then finally, this little chapel of the Monastery of the Virgins, 13th century, down by the river. And you can see it again on the reconstruction and on the map. And I'm using that as a model just to point out the characteristics, the main characteristics of Armenian churches. Next slide, please. And here we are. So Armenian churches are centrally planned. What that means is that they're planned around usually a circle with a dome on top. Whereas in the West, of course, we have a church with an altar at one end, just like our cathedral here, with a long nave and with aisles. And that's described as a basilical building based on the Greek type of building, a laterally planned building. So Armenian churches are centrally planned, and they have these very tall domes with a point. Now that's often thought of as representing Mount Ararat, as reaching up into heaven. And let's look at the characteristics. Centrally planned, I've mentioned, pointed conical or semi-conical domes, radially segmented on a cylindrical drum. Well, that you can see the radiance on that for our live audience. You can see that come down here, and I hope the Zoomers can see it on their slide. Reinforcement of the verticality with tall, narrow windows. So the windows are usually quite like slits, pointed again, but of course that helps the actual construction, the thrust of the dome taking the weight down. Stone vaulted ceilings generally. There are some other materials, but generally they're made of stone. And it's abundant stone in this area, volcanic or basalt stone. A composite roof, and this is a really wonderful bit of craftsman, finely cut tufa shingles, slates. And then inside, frescoes and carvings, often, and Armenian art loves swirling foliage, always lots of swirling foliage, the life of nature. The tall structural arches for supporting the cupola. The cupola is, of course, the top part of the dome. And you've got, again, roofs intersecting to support that dome. So you've got the roofs at the lower level here coming in and here supporting the drum of the dome. And finally, often you have sculptural decoration on the outside walls as well in a particular style. They would include foliage and sometimes figures. And you can see from this slide, we're looking up on the top right, up into the cupola, and you can see there's supporting domes each side. So you've got lots of what's called triangular pendentives holding up the dome. Because if your architects are amongst us here, you'll realize the problem with when you've got centrally planned buildings is the supporting the weight of that dome. It has to be channeled down, and the triangular pendentives take it down to the semi-cupolas there and bring it down. And then you can see some of the decoration, exterior decoration on the bottom right-hand slide. Intertwined, a lot of intertwining, some of it quite reminiscent of Celtic art in the way it intertwines. Next slide, please. And here's a monastery, Noravank, 13th century, very interesting, cantilevered steps going up. That's quite a breakthrough with cantilevered steps going right up to the first floor. And there's two timpana there. The top one has the Mother of God with Peter and Paul either side. Sorry, that has Jesus, Peter and Paul's side, and the other one's the Mother of God below with Michael and Gabriel either side. But I wanted also to draw your attention to this slide. I mean, it is beautiful, and the height it receives with the open drum around the conical dome is quite amazing. But I want to draw your attention to these stones here. Very important part of Armenian culture and Armenian art. Next slide, please. These are kachkas, and they are quite special to Armenia, quite unique. And they're stones that are set up, and they can represent various things, not just tombstones, but often they are tombstones. Sometimes they are like an altar or a memory or an important place, but they are very significant. And there's quite a lot of thought. But look at the craftsmanship of that kachka at Gayumri on the right there. The interweaving is quite sensational. So they're called cross stones. They often have these additional motifs, as well as the cross, rosettes, botanical motifs, and you can see how intertwined they are. And if we look at this, I can run through. I mean, there's about 150 of these kachkas at Gayumri, but there's a theological explanation for each of it. 4 wings of the cross. The upper wings show the kingdom of heaven. The lower symbolize the demolition of hell, the triumph of trampling over hell. The right one means grace, distribution, and the left is the remission of sins. They're also said to represent the 4 virtues of inner self. The upper part is a symbol of love, the lower is modesty, the right is obedience, and the left is patience. So they have a symbolic significance as well as being aesthetically, I think, very beautiful. Very important part, the kachka. Next slide, please. But the peace of Armenia is not settled between now the 2 superpowers, the Byzantines and the Arabs. Byzantines capture Ani and annex Armenia in the 11th century under Basil II. Basil II was a great restorer of the Byzantine Empire, and he expanded both east and west. He was the one known as Basil the Bulgar Slayer because he conquered the Bulgarians. But all things were going to change after Byzantium captured Ani with the Seljuk Turks, the arrival of the Turks coming from the east. And in 1064, the Seljuk Turks capture Ani and destroy it. The Byzantines fight back, no longer, sadly, under Basil, but they fight back, and there's a big battle at Manzikert, 1071, and this was to change the world forever. The Byzantines are defeated and the Seljuk Turks pour into Anatolia. And of course, on their way, they go over Armenia. And Armenia is now sent into quite a dark period as it struggles to maintain its identity under the Seljuk Turks. What many of the Armenians do is they flee and leave Greater Armenia for this area on the left hand, Cilicia, what is now the southeastern corner of Turkey. And they establish themselves there and set up a kingdom based on Sis and around that area. So the Rubenids established this Armenian principality. It then becomes a kingdom, and Leon I is crowned king of Armenian Cilicia in 1198. And they are partly allies with the Byzantines because of the Christian nature, but they actually very much welcome the Crusades and become important allies of the Crusaders. And there's a silver coin there of Leo, you can see on the right. And down on the right-hand side, there is the fortress of Sis, which again is quite a tourist attraction these days. So a new Armenian kingdom is established. And this is going to have consequences for the Armenian Church, as we shall see later. Next slide, please. But all is going to change because of this man, Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan, with his Mongol hordes, sweeps through the area, destroying everything. The Mongols famous for their savagery and their destruction. And as you can see from that live map, how he expands, and by 1259, he's conquered large areas. 1290 shows what's happened to his empire, which has been split between his sons. That's what you see. This is no idea whether this is a likeness of Genghis or not, because it's a much later 14th century portrait, and it's very much done in a sort of Chinese style. And it's now in a museum in Taipei in Taiwan. But he turns the world upside down. That whole area, the Mongol invasion, destroys everything. And not only slaughters, but deports large numbers of Armenians and Byzantines and so on. Next slide, please. Barely having recovered, the world having recovered from Genghis Khan, then along comes the Turks from Central Asia under Timur, or Tamerlane as we know him. And he's just as vicious. The fall of the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia to the Egyptian Mamelukes. So even that area, that respite area for Armenians, is overwhelmed. And Timur then conquers the Caucasus and Anatolia. I always remember at school learning about Tamerlane the Great. Did any of you do a famous play by Christopher Marlowe, Tamerlane? Did you read that? There's a wonderful bit in it. Timur is such a great conqueror. He overwhelms the Ottoman Empire and defeats the Sultan, Bajazet I, and actually captures him. And according to one story, though it's not historically proven, drags him around his empire in a gilded cage. And in Christopher Marlowe's play, which is quite a wordy play, well, if you're a schoolboy, you're not paying attention all the time, but there's a bit that made us all jump up in the class. There's a point where Bajazet is so humiliated, he decides to kill himself. And he's on stage in the gilded cage, and there's a stage instruction which says, Bajazet beats his brains out on the cage. And this has actually been performed at the National Theatre, and apparently they used a lot of jelly. It's a terrible story. We've no idea if it was true or not. We do know, of course, that he was captured, and some historians say he was very well treated and so on and so forth. Others say he was humiliated, used as a footstool, and dragged around the cage. But Tamerlane was a fearsome warrior, and you can see the area there that he conquered. The lighter green, of course, was let go, was just areas that he reached, but the empire was the darker green area. So the Armenians found themselves again under a powerful ruler, again, much of the infrastructure smashed up by Timur and his hordes because they were very destructive in their way they went. I recently was in Tashkent, where there's a huge monument to their great national hero, Timur. And you're never quite sure, of course, one description of those who were conquered by him see him as brutal and terrible, and of course, the other side see him as a national hero and a conqueror. So, but one good thing happens for the Armenians with regard to the Ottoman Empire, which re-establishes itself after the overthrow of Bajazet. And when Mehmed II conquers Constantinople in 1452, he is relatively civilized in that conquest. He certainly wants the Byzantine Greek aristocracy to work for him, and they become the famous phanariots who do all the administration of the empire and so on. But also he establishes an Armenian patriarchy to look after those Armenians who are within the Ottoman Empire. And that, of course, still exists today. We should come on to that. Next slide, please. So Armenia, I put this one, survives again. This country has been battered between the superpowers, overwhelmed, invasions. It's still there, surviving. And what happens, interestingly, in 1439 at the Council of Florence, a union is declared between the Armenian Church of Cilicia and Rome. So the Armenian Church becomes split between the Apostolic Church, following the Apostles, which is still independent, and the Catholic Church, which recognizes the Pope as the leader of that church. So there is an Armenian Catholic Church, now as we see, mainly based in Lebanon, in Beirut, we'll come on to that, and there's still the Apostolic Church, which is independent. Interestingly enough, the Pope wasn't too worried about whether the Sicilian Armenians were Miaphysite or not. And much of the liturgy that goes on in the Catholic Armenian Church is similar to the Apostolic liturgy. The 16th century sees Armenia as the center of the Ottoman Safavid Wars, Persia again, and the Turks fighting over Armenia. These two superpowers in the area, Armenia once again crunched in the middle, the story of Armenia's life to be crunched. With regard to the church, there's a real help with printing, and there's an Armenian press established in Constantinople. So the Bible is printed in Armenian language and can be circulated. Very important, particularly for those Armenians who have been displaced, the beginning of the Armenian diaspora, displaced by living in other parts, other countries, or other empires. But it doesn't get much better. In the 17th century, at the beginning, Shah Abbas decides on imperial conquest to the north and to the west. And he destroys the Armenian towns and villages, and we're told deports over 300,000 Armenians back into Persia. Of those, only half survive. So the agony of Armenia in terms of deportation and slaughter goes on. The Armenians turn to the Russians, who are Christians, to help, but the Russians are also imperialistic. And although they are helped by the Armenian hero, David Beck, a wonderful character, and you can see a modern sculpture of him over there. David Beck was only around for a short time, but he has legendary status in Armenia as one of their important heroes. The Armenians find themselves still in the middle. What happens in Cilicia is the Patriarch of Cis is now a Catholic convert, and so the confirmation of what started in the Council of Florence now is confirmed at sort of ground level, and the Cilician Catholic Church is founded. And 1749, the Pope recognizes this. I've put at the bottom here, and I had to be quite selective, as you could imagine, in terms of the history. I put at the bottom here Joseph Emin, because Joseph Emin was a nationalist leader fighting for the independence of Armenia. Didn't get very far, in fact, wasn't terribly successful, but he came to London, was educated in London, and he left London to go back to his homeland and try to rally the troops. As I say, he wasn't actually particularly successful and ended up in India, but he wrote his memoirs, The Life and Adventures, which his great-granddaughter sorted out and published. So you can actually see his life, which is a fascinating life, and all his travels. It's slightly disappointing in that he wasn't able to get enough support in Armenia at the time to rally for independence, but it was all part of that Enlightenment movement about independence of people and recognizing their freedom. Next slide, please. Now, I had to put this in because this is another British connection, an English connection. This is the monastery of St. Lazarus, the Armenian monastery in Venice. And you can see an aerial view of the monastery, which originally, of course, was a hospital and was there for the lepers and was converted. So it has a long history, but in the beginning of the 18th century, 12 Armenian monks who had fled from Cilicia went to Greece. And from Greece, fleeing again from the Ottomans, they went to Venice and were welcomed and established this monastery. So this monastery was there, and in the beginning of the 19th century, Lord Byron went there to learn Armenian. And he learned enough Armenian to be able to do translations and even put forward a dictionary. So he did very well, but obviously a very bright character. And the monastery is very proud of the fact that Byron went there. And you can see there's a plaque there referring to their friend, their devoted friend, Lord Byron. And I've put a little bit of what he says about his visit. This is Lord Byron learning Armenian. He says, "I have chosen to torture me into attention." He was a bit lazing around. Apart from having an affair with several ladies in Venice, such was the nature of Lord Byron, he obviously felt he needed to do something more serious. And so off he went to learn Armenian. It's a rich language, however, and would amply repay any one of the trouble of learning it. I try and shall go on, but I answer for nothing, least of all my intentions or my success. But he was actually reasonably successful, given the short time he was there learning it. So that's another connection, Lord Byron. And of course, you can go and visit. You have to book, but you can go and visit the monastery. And they're very proud of the fact that Byron was there, and you only have to say that you're English, and you get special treatment. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sure if you said you were Scots or Welsh, it would work as well. But now we get on to a really sad part, and I apologize for this, but we have to look at it. This is what's happened to Armenia in the modern day. The Russians occupy Yerevan, which are welcomed by some Armenians. However, the Russian government wants to control everything, and so they restrict the power of the Armenian Church and want to bring the Armenian Church under the Russian Orthodox Patriarchy. While this is going on, the Ottomans are under pressure, and Sultan Abdul Hamid tries to revive the nationalism of the Ottoman Empire by instituting massacres, mainly of Armenians, but also of some other Christians. And the top right-hand side there, I'm afraid, is a picture of the massacre at Erzurum in 1895. A grisly picture. And it doesn't get any better, because then even in Cilician Armenia, the local Muslims are aroused to massacre in Adana. And as massacres there, probably as many as 30,000. We don't quite know the number. The records are not very clear. And it only gets worse, because the First World War breaks out and the Young Turks try and re-establish Ottoman pride through Islam. And the Armenians are seen as a fifth column, because the Russians are pressing in the Caucasus against the Turks and are having some success. The Armenians are Christian and therefore are not to be trusted. So the Turkish government decides, we will deport them. Not just deport them, we'll also slaughter them. So a massacre takes place. And this has become an area of some controversy. Independent sources reckon at least about 1.5 million Armenians died during the deportations and the massacres. And it has been labeled genocide. However, the Turkish government refuses to recognize it as genocide. 31 nations have recognized it, including, just 2 years ago, the United States. We are in a very odd position with the United Kingdom. Scotland and Wales recognize the genocide. England doesn't. And it's probably partly politics and our relationship with Turkey and so on. It has become extremely political. And when you read about it, those who recognize the genocide will recognize the massacre of the Armenians and the deportation. And you can see what happened with the Armenians who were deported. They were deported without food or water, marched into the desert, and of course succumbed. Turkish side is that many people died in the First World War, and a lot of Turks also died. And yes, they did try and deport some of the Armenians, but it was never genocide. It was just an incident, one of those things that happened. Well, I leave it to you to judge, and you can tell what side of the fence I'm on. I put this map in, which you can't possibly see, and I put it on because it's an illustration. Look at the red dots all over the place. Those are dots where Armenians were killed, and we have evidence that they were killed. So even if you don't recognize it as a genocide, it was a pretty wide-ranging massacre, devastating to Armenia and devastating to many, many families who lost their ancestors. After the defeat of Turkey, there is a chance that Greater Armenia will be established, and I'll come on to that. However, because of the Russian Revolution, all the treaties that would involve Russia and the Western powers fall apart and are renegotiated. Armenia seizes this opportunity to declare an independent republic, and Armenia declares an independent republic, not quite on the scale of Greater Armenia, but the mountainous Caucasus area. However, the Soviet Union then absorbs Armenia in 1920, and the republic is swept away, and it becomes an oblast. Armenia becomes an administrative area in the USSR, and Turkey establishes a new frontier so that the western part of Armenia is lost forever. Depopulated now, of course, through the massacres, and territorially lost. Ataturk seizes it. And interestingly enough, just as an odd thing I came across, Ataturk establishes a new capital for Turkey in Ankara. And he's looking for a building in which he can establish the presidential palace. What does he choose? He chooses the home of an Armenian who had been killed, a man called Kabasyan, who had built a beautiful villa just on the edge of Ankara, and Ataturk takes it over as his new presidential palace. It is actually the vice president's palace these days. So not only were they massacred but robbed, but what a symbol. Next slide, please. Now, this is just to rehearse where we were. I'm nearly coming to the end. If we look at this map, you can see the greatest extent of Armenia under Tigranes the Great in 70 BC. You can then see Cilician Armenia to the left, that area. Then if you look at the yellow dotted area, that's historic Armenia. That started out where we started out with Urartu, that area. Then, if you look at the red dotted area, this is really interesting. This was the Armenia proposed by Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, at Versailles. This was to be the Armenia. And if it hadn't been for the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution and the rise of Ataturk, that's probably what we would be looking at today as Armenia. Remember, Woodrow Wilson was the person who established Czechoslovakia and so on. He greatly believed in the independence of ethnic groups, and he wanted to give Armenia their homeland. However, that fell apart. The first Armenian Republic is the solid red line. And then the second Armenian Republic since 1921 within the Soviet Union is just that beige area, which is the present day Armenia. So we've got a shrinking Armenia, and it's relatively quite small. Next slide, please. I mentioned at the beginning the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh and what, in a way, started off this talk, because I probably wouldn't have suggested doing the Armenian Church if it hadn't been for this conflict. Nagorno-Karabakh, as I say, is an area populated by Armenians, but found itself, unfortunately, during the Soviet Union, surrounded by Azerbaijan. And it's become an area of great conflict. In 1988, the war started out, even under the Soviet Union, as Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh did not want to be part or ruled by Islam and Azerbaijan. In 1991, the conflict broke out with independence, and the Armenians were able to not only capture Nagorno-Karabakh, but a lot of the surrounding area. And they used this surrounding area as a buffer state. Now, both sides, I think, can take the blame for ethnic cleansing. There was a lot of ethnic cleansing on both sides. Armenians who had lived happily in Azerbaijan and Baku were ethnically cleansed, and Azerbaijanis who lived around the area of Nagorno-Karabakh were ethnically cleansed. And there were refugee camps, large refugee camps in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan was ruled by the dictatorial family called the Aliyevs, and they still rule today. The OSCE won't recognize their elections because they're a fraud, and it's a dictatorship, essentially. Armenia does much better, though there are still some things wrong with democracy in Armenia, but relatively, it's high up the list, whereas Azerbaijan isn't. Azerbaijan is much bigger than Armenia. Armenia's about 3 million, 2,900,000. Although, of course, there are about 10 million Armenians, but 7 million of those live in the diaspora, having either fled during the conflicts between Persia and Russia, or having fled because of the First World War and what happened there, the survivors. So there's a big diaspora, quite a large number in America, over 1.5 million, quite a large number in France, not so many in the UK, and I'll come on to the numbers in UK. But all around the world, over 30 countries, you will find Armenian communities who are part of that diaspora. But going back to Nagorno-Karabakh, so Azerbaijan felt this was an insult and always vowed that they would recapture the lands that they lost. And last year, with the help of Turkey, and some of you will know President Erdogan has a view of re-establishing the Ottoman Empire. Erdogan gave military support. Syrian mercenaries were hired, and the Armenians were badly defeated. Mainly, interesting, some modern warfare. A lot of drones took out outdated Armenian Russian tanks. Armenia depends on Russia for its independence. There's a big Russian military camp in Armenia, and Russia calls the tune. It called the tune in 1991, where it stood back and let the Armenians take over Nagorno-Karabakh and the surrounding area. Putin has changed that policy, and it may be something to do with what has been going on in Syria and Russian bases in Syria and its control with Syria, but Russia stood back and allowed Azerbaijan to reconquer lots of those areas. And what you're seeing in this map here, although you probably can't see it very well, is what's actually happened. Nagorno-Karabakh, the central area, under Stepanakert, has remained Armenian. So that hasn't been lost to Armenia. But the surrounding areas, which were mainly populated by Azeris, the Azerbaijanis, Azeris as they're called, have been reconquered, brought back into Azerbaijan. And the thing that ended the war was the capture of the town of Susha. Susha, as you can see, is very near Stepanakert, and it looked like that might fall at one point. A lot of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh had to flee and went into Armenia. Russia stepped in at this point, and Russia now controls the access to Nagorno-Karabakh, Russian peacekeepers. Now, it's a failure of modern diplomacy, all of this, because after the war in 1991, a group was set up called the Minsk Group, the Americans, the Russians, and the French, to try and bring peace to Azerbaijan and to Armenia. And they failed all the way. I had a friend of mine, an ex-colleague, who was at the London School of Economics, who was part of that peace mission and went there and saw it was unreconcilable, she felt, in terms of what was going to happen. But the Minsk Group failed, I think, badly to bring about peace. And the consequence was this war with many Armenians being killed, many more Armenians being killed than Azeris, mainly because the Azerbaijan army decided that civilians were a legitimate target, and that's what happened. So it's a sad end. As far as Armenia is concerned, the good news is that Nagorno-Karabakh has stayed in Armenia and hasn't, but it was populated by Armenians. It would have been a travesty if they had been ethnically cleansed and Azeris moved in. But it's still quite a tense situation. Just recently, there was an election in Armenia, and the prime minister was re-elected. And I think it was a measure of the fact that there was no alternative really to this peace treaty, which was signed in last year in 2020. So that's the situation, but it still could be a powder keg. It may be still a trigger area. And there are many Armenians who are very disgusted with their government in terms of having lost the territory. On the other hand, for a small country like Armenia, 3 million up against Azerbaijan, which is over 11 million, it would have been very difficult for them to hold on to that territory. So that's the politics. Next slide, please. But let's have a look at the Armenian Church today, and where are we? Well, interesting enough, the head of the church, there's two. There's two heads of church because of the split of Armenia between Greater Armenia and Cilician Armenia. So in the Apostolic Church, there are two Catholicoi, and there's Catholicoi Karayenkin II of all Armenia, and then Arab I of Cilicia. So there's two Catholicoi, and they also have the title of patriarch. So they're Catholicoi and they're patriarchs. There are two patriarchs at the next level down, which cover Jerusalem and the Holy Lands, and Jordan, and Constantinople and Turkey. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a patriarch of Constantinople who happens to be Mashalian at the moment. And then you've got primates, archbishops, bishops, and clergy. And like all Eastern Christian churches, the clergy at the lower level are allowed to marry. But if they want to rise higher, they have to be single. It's a sort of oddity of the Orthodox Christianity, as it is also the Armenian Church. But then, of course, you also have the Armenian Catholic Church, which, as I mentioned, is mainly based in Beirut and Lebanon, where many of the diaspora from Cilicia, of course, went. And there's a big argument about the numbers of the Catholic Church. The Pope claims there's 750,000 members, but the Apostolic Church says there's only about 150,000. So you can see there's a bit of rivalry going on there. And so there's a Patriarch of Cilicia based in Beirut, and that's the wonderful Raphael Pedros Messalian. And the Pope is the head of that church. But interestingly enough, as I said earlier, if you look at the liturgy, it's very similar. Next, except I should mention, they don't use icons in the liturgy in the Catholic Church, whereas they do in the Apostolic Church. And, the priest is covered by a curtain, but not in the Apostolic Church. So there are some minor differences. Next slide, please. What about Armenians in the UK? Well, Nationals, at the last census, there was 1,700 nationals with Armenian identity. But of course, in terms of Armenian descent, we reckon the figure's about 18,000. I stand corrected if anyone can give a better figure on that, but I think it's about 18,000. And there are 3 Armenian apostolic churches, and the most famous one you can see on the right there, which is built in the Armenian style, whereas the other churches have tended to take over Protestant churches and are built in the basilical style. So you've got St. Sarkis in Kensington, Yegic in South Kensington, and the Holy Trinity in Manchester. So there's a nice little core of Armenians in Manchester. And I thought I'd put this one on. Prince Charles addresses the Armenian congregation. And what he was saying back in 2014 was this persecution, not just of Armenians, but of Christians in the East, has got to stop. We know that through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, all these areas, Christians are under enormous pressure from a resurgent fundamentalist Islam. And it's not easy at all for Christians in that area. Next slide. And thank you for being such an excellent audience. I've gone slightly over time, but not too bad. And I'm just doing a plug for my next talk. On the 27th of January, I'll be doing Pagan to Christian, the development of early Christian art. So put that in your diaries.
Thank you very much for that, Tim. For someone who knew very little about this subject before coming into this talk, I can safely say that I've learned an awful lot, and I'm sure you will all agree with me. How you managed to squeeze that much history into just over an hour is incredible, and I think we are all very grateful that you did so. I think this is now a good opportunity to open the floor up. If any of you do have any questions, please raise your hand and I will come and deliver this microphone to you. Equally, if we have any questions from online as well, we'll be happy to take them too.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting talk, Tim. I'm Bill Free, I live in St Albans. On one of your slides, you said in 387, there seemed to be a state called Albania next to Armenia, which caught me a bit. I thought I was looking at the wrong map for a moment. Is that the sort of common name with the other Albania?
It was in ancient times called Albania, yes. I guess it's, I suppose that when you think of the Latin, it's a common name, a white state. It's a white, you know, like we've got our synth white. So yes, there was an Albania there, and it was a mountainous area on what is now bordering on Azerbaijan and Armenia, that side, yes. So there was a genuine Albania there. And we think of Albania as off the Adriatic Sea, or yes, it's odd, isn't it? Well, we've got our own Albania here. I actually asked someone the other day if they were Albanian, and they, no, I'm Greek. What I meant was they come from St Albans.
Common name.
Any other questions at all?
When the Turks were laying siege to Vienna and Christian Europe came together, and I can't remember when it was, 1500, wasn't it?
Yeah, yes.
Thereabouts.
Yes. We're thinking of the first siege of Vienna, Suleiman, I think, because there were two, of course.
I mean, and the Ottoman Empire was at its peak, maybe. What was going on in Armenia? I mean, were they left behind in all that?
Well, in fact, yes, the movement to Armenia came, or to the east came later, after the movement to the west. So one tends to think of the Ottoman Empire, of course, as being centered in what is now Turkey, but actually it was more centered in Europe initially. And the Ottomans came from the European side and went back to Anatolia. So at that time, when Europe was being saved by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was relatively quiet on the Eastern Front, but then they soon turned their attention to the Eastern Front. So, but they were up against, of course, the Persians there. So it was a tricky area, and of course Persians took advantage of that. The Safavids took advantage of that.
Armenia was in the balance, really.
Armenia's always, as I call about being crunched, it's been this central area where you've got people moving mainly from east to west, but sometimes also, like the Romans, west to east. So it's always been there, that middle ground, which explains a lot of what's happened to it in its history. What is amazing is that it's been able to preserve its identity and its national culture through really very difficult times. I mean, and it must have been touch and go when you see what happened at the end of the First World War, how it was going to survive.
Okay, so we have one question from our online audience, which is, how did the church cope during the communist era? Was there any sort of significant impact at all?
It's a good question.
It's a very good question.
They were under a lot of pressure. And it's a bit like what happened also in Russia itself. There were some within the church who, recognizing the sort of compromise, would compromise with the Soviet authorities. But generally church going, and the church was discouraged. There wasn't the same level of destruction that you got in Russia itself. You may remember Stalin. How many churches did he blow up? I can't remember the figure now, but it's a huge number of churches he blew up, destroyed. There wasn't that level of destruction in Armenia. And I think because, in a sense, it was a frontier area out of there. It was left alone more. But there was certainly what some people thought was too much reverence for the Soviet system from some church leaders, and others were a bit more militant. But the faith, I think, so embedded is that faith as part of what it means to be Armenian. So embedded, it went a bit underground, but it survived. And then it reflourished again. I mean, what's happened, and we've seen this again and again, haven't we, with countries where they've been overwhelmed by bigger powers, their nationalism has been embedded in religion and the church. So if you think of Greece, to be a Greek, only just recently, you were allowed to be a Greek without being Orthodox. It had to be on your passport. And then if you see what's happened in the Eastern blocs, my wife comes from Croatia. In Croatia, Roman Catholicism has been incredibly important. You can't really be a Croat, can you, without being a Catholic? I think she's agreeing. But also in Serbia too. So nationalism is often embedded in their history because the church carries that culture through adverse times, and particularly, through communism or through imposition of other religions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim. I think unless there are any final questions.
I'm sorry to be greedy, but
no.
Where you read now about the Maronite Christians in Lebanon, who I don't think we'd lump in with the people who are being particularly oppressed anyhow, are they connected with the sort of Catholic Armenia there then? Is that the same thing, or are they?
No, they're separate. The Maronites are, when I was sort of nodding, they're connected with the Catholic Church, so they recognize the Pope. And of course but they're really, ever since the introduction of Hezbollah into Lebanon, they've been under huge pressure. So Christians in Lebanon do feel under pressure and are holding Lebanon together in the way it used to be, the Paris of the Middle East. Holding that together seems, it's in a dire state now. It's just tragic what's happening there. And of course it had a civil war, basically. And that was a civil war, essentially on religious grounds again. Religion being used. And we've seen it throughout, even the Islamic world, Shia and Sunni and Alawite, the same tensions operate within one faith as they do between faiths. So this resurgence in a sense of fundamentalism in all sorts of religions, I think, is very damaging. And though in a sense, I've been praising the Armenian nationalism, I wouldn't want to see the Armenian church use it as a nationalistic stick to beat anybody else. I don't think they have. But certainly in terms of the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, religion and the Islamic faith and the Christian faith is incredibly important. That's what divides the two.
And if you if you take the way you describe the Soviet Union treated the Armenian Christian church, I think that they probably treated the Muslim religion in their territories in a similar way. They didn't mess with it in the way they did it back in Mother Russia, as it were.
Well, during that 19th century, the Russo-Turkish Wars and the Russo-Persian Wars, they were seeing themselves as fundamentally protecting the Christians. And their job was to protect the Christians. And that relationship, say, still goes on. Say, for example, Christian Orthodox Serbia is protected by Russia. It has a special relationship. And there was a point where they were going to, and they did actually under one treaty, get Constantinople back for the Christians. It didn't last long because the great powers, Britain, France and Germany, would not allow it. But so they saw themselves as missionaries, I think, for Christianity in that way. But of course, once they were there, they wanted the Russian Orthodox Church to control the Armenian Church. And they said, you break it down from the big arguments to the interfaith arguments, I suppose, and that's what's happened. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, did I see one more question down here?
Contribution to say that, may I take this up, is to say that your talk was very, very interesting, and thank you very much for talking about Armenians, and I'm very grateful to you. Considering that after the First World War and after the genocide, Russia, Bolsheviks took over. And then I understand that Stalin very kindly handed over a piece of land of Armenia we call it Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, to the Azeris. Azeris were Tatars. They are not the Azeris, as I understand, of the region of northern Iran. I may be wrong, correct me. Since then, there has been trouble. There has been no trouble about Armenian religion in Iran, Persia, ever since we were taken there by Shah Abbas the Great. Although, as you said, many died then, my ancestors possibly a lot. But my point is, Stalin has affected the situation, whereas given a big land, a lot of Armenian land, and you were talking about the ethnic cleansing, we must not forget Sumgait in 1990s or 1988, I can't remember, 1988, where a huge number of Armenians were burnt alive in Sumgait.
Yes,
and
I mean,
must not be forgotten.
There were some terrible riots, and again, the mobs were out to kill the other side, and it was tragic. Yes, and you're quite right about Stalin. Stalin played this game with all sorts of nationalities. He moved people around. He moved, for example, if you're thinking about the Crimea, he moved the Chechens, he moved the Turkomans, he moved all sorts of people around to break down, I suppose, nationalism. That was part of the thing. And he did interfere, and he did give Nagorno-Karabakh, as I say, to the Azerbaijani Oblast. And also the other odd area, Nakhchivan. Azerbaijan is divided by Armenia. It's just a crazy situation. And unfortunately, because it seems we as a human race find it very difficult to absorb and live with minorities who don't represent us, don't we? And unfortunately, that's what's happened. So we saw it in Yugoslavia, we saw it, but the ethnic cleansing is a way of solving that problem. We've seen it in Cyprus. Cyprus divided between the recognized Greek South, which is part of the European Union, and the northern part, which is not recognized and is Turkish Cyprus. So again and again. But Stalin was famous for just moving people around and playing games to break up, and terrible things, for example, that he did in Ukraine in terms of starving out people. So yes, Stalin was a very awful man. and what he did was very awful.
Okay, so I think that probably brings us to time. I'd like to just finish by saying one last big thank you to Professor Tim Boatswain for coming and sharing his infinite amount of knowledge with us tonight. And also a big thank you to you, our audience, both in person and online. If you want to find out anything else that we have coming up as part of our adult learning program, do have a look on our website on stalbanscathedral.org under the learning section. And I hope to welcome you to another talk again soon. If we can just finish with one more round of applause for Tim Boatswain.
Thanks very much. I feel really bad. I finished on a banality. Stalin is a really awful man. I'm sorry about that.